Tessy had always known how to want two things at once. She wanted peace, but she craved fire. She wanted security, but she ached for passion. She wanted Nnamdi's money, but she could not stop loving Chukwudi. So, she had both. That was the simplest way to say it. She had both. And for 4 years, the arrangement had worked with the kind of precision that only a very careful, very cold woman could maintain. Nnamdi Okafor, her husband of 4 years, was a real estate developer in Abuja. Tall, solid, generous in the way that wealthy men are generous when they believe a beautiful wife is something they have earned. He bought her a Lexus. He built them a house in Gwarimpa, with a garden and a boys' quarters, and a gate with an intercom. He called her name and meant it. He was not a bad man. That was the part Tessy never let herself think about for too long. Chukwudi was something else entirely. He was the man who had held her face in his hands at 19 and told her she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, in a way that made her believe it had nothing to do with her face. He was a mechanic in Logbe, brilliant with engines, hopeless with money, and when Tessy's mother had sat her down at 25 and said that boy cannot take care of you, you hear me? He cannot give you anything. Tessy had cried for 3 weeks and then accepted Nnamdi's proposal. She told herself she would forget Chukwudi. Instead, 6 months into her marriage, she had called him. Just to hear his voice, she told herself. He came to her on a Tuesday. He always came on Tuesdays and Thursdays when Nnamdi was at his site in Karu. He came, and the 4 years disappeared, and they were 19 again, in the small room behind his mother's house, in Enugu, and nothing in the world had weight or consequence. When she got pregnant the first time, she told Nnamdi it was his. He had wept. He had literally wept, this big man with his expensive suits and his fleet of cars. He had held her stomach and wept with joy and said, God has remembered us. The baby came out looking exactly like Chukwudi. She told herself Nnamdi would never notice. She told herself children sometimes just looked like the mother's side of the family. She told herself a lot of things in those years. She had become very good at it. The second pregnancy came 2 years later. Another Tuesday baby. Another child with Chukwudi's deep-set eyes and Chukwudi's stubborn jaw. Nnamdi named her Precious and bought her a gold bracelet on the day she was born. It was a Friday evening in March when everything ended. Tessy remembered the specific quality of the light that evening, orange and heavy. The kind of Abuja sunset that made even ordinary things look beautiful. She was in the kitchen making jollof rice when she heard Nnamdi's car pull into the compound. She did not think anything of it. He came home on Fridays, but then she heard his footsteps and they were wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. She turned around. Nnamdi was standing in the kitchen doorway holding his phone. On the screen was a photograph. She did not need to look closely. She already knew what it was. Chukwudi had sent her a voice note that afternoon, and she had forgotten to delete the thread. Just forgotten. 4 years of careful architecture, and she had forgotten because she was tired, because she was human, because even the most meticulous lies eventually develop cracks. How long? Nnamdi said. His voice was very quiet. Tessy opened her mouth. How long? It was not a question anymore. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would help her now, and some part of her brain was already calculating, already moving past this moment to what came next. The children were at her mother's place in Kubwa for the weekend. The house was empty. The neighbors on the left had traveled. The compound wall was high. Nnamdi took one step into the kitchen, then another. His face had done something she had never seen it do before. It had collapsed inward, like a building losing its foundation floor by floor. And what was left was not anger, not yet, but a kind of devastation, so complete. It looked like a man standing at the edge of something he could not come back from. Those children, he said, and his voice broke on the second word. Tessy, those children. She saw his eyes fill, and something in her did not soften. That was the thing she could never explain afterward, not to herself, not to anyone. Something in her watched his eyes fill, and felt only the cold panic of a person whose secret has been found. And her gaze moved to the kitchen counter, where the knife sat beside the half-chopped tomatoes. And the thought arrived, not gradually, but all at once, fully formed, the way the worst thoughts always do. She moved before she understood she was moving. She called Chukwudi at 9:47 p.m. "Come," she said. "Come now. Don't ask me anything. Just come." He arrived at 11. He stood in the kitchen doorway, the same doorway, and looked at the floor, and looked at her, and said nothing for a very long time. "Tessy." His voice was barely sound. "Help me," she said. Later, she would think about that moment. How he had hesitated. How she had watched the hesitation move across his face like a shadow, and then disappear. How he had walked to the garage and come back with a shovel without her asking. She would think about what that meant, that he loved her enough for this, or that he feared losing her enough for this, or that there was simply no real difference between those two things. They buried Nnamdi in the garden behind the house, beneath the frangipani tree he had planted himself on the day they moved in. She had always loved the smell of that tree. She could not have known, then, what it would mean to her in the months that followed. The next morning, Tessy showered, dressed her children when she collected them from her mother, made them breakfast. And at 10 a.m., she walked into the Gwarimpa police division and told the officer at the desk that her husband had not come home and was not answering his phone. She performed worry beautifully. She had always been a woman who understood the power of a composed face and perfectly timed tears. She told them Nnamdi had mentioned something about a site in Jos. She told them he sometimes went off-grid when he was stressed. She told them she was probably overreacting. The officer wrote something down and told her to come back in 48 hours if he still hadn't returned. She thanked him and walked back to her Lexus Nnamdi's gift and drove home. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. Detectives came. His family came. His business partner came. Questions were asked, and Tessy answered every one of them, with the steadiness of a woman holding something very heavy, very still. She cried at the right moments. She allowed his mother to hold her. She let his sister move in for 2 weeks to help with the children, and cooked for her, and did laundry, and listened to the woman weep for her brother every night through the wall. 6 weeks became 3 months. 3 months became 6. The case went cold. People stopped coming. His family stopped calling every day. Life moved in its terrible, indifferent way forward, always forward, and Tessy began, cautiously, to believe that she had survived it. Chukwudi came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The frangipani tree bloomed. The first dream came on a Wednesday night in September. In the dream, she was in the kitchen again, the orange light, the jollof rice. She turned around and Nnamdi was in the doorway, but he was not the Nnamdi of that Friday evening. He was not devastated, not broken. He was standing very still and very straight, and his eyes were open too wide, and on the front of his agbada, there was a dark, spreading stain that she could not look at directly. He said her name. Just that. Just Tessy. In his old voice, the voice he used when he was being tender, when he called her name, when he held the children and wept with a happiness she had never been able to give him back in equal measure. She woke up screaming. The bedroom was dark. The children were asleep down the hall. The clock read 3:14 a.m., and the room was completely, utterly empty, and she sat in the silence, pressing her hands to her chest, and told herself it was guilt. Just guilt. The mind processes what the daylight hours refuse to carry. It was nothing. It was nothing. Then she turned on the bedside lamp. He was standing in the corner of the room. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Not her mind constructing shapes from darkness. He was standing in the corner between the wardrobe and the window. And he was wearing what he had been wearing that Friday, the blue and white agbada, and he was looking directly at her, with those eyes that were open too wide, and the room was suddenly ice cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Tessy screamed. She screamed and lunged for the door and ran down the hallway and did not stop running until she was in the living room with every light on and the television playing at full volume and her back against the wall. And she stayed there until dawn broke grey and uncertain through the curtains. She told herself it was a hallucination, sleep deprivation, grief. Even murderers grieved, didn't they? Even the worst people carried the weight of what they'd done in ways the body expressed without permission. She called Chukwudi in the morning and told him what she'd seen. There was a long silence. "You're tired," he said. "You're not sleeping well. It's stress." "Chukwudi, it's stress," he said firmly. "There's nothing there. You hear me? There is nothing there." She wanted to believe him. 3 days later, she was driving to work on the Kubwa Expressway, the radio playing, the morning traffic thick and slow, and she glanced in the rearview mirror to check on the children in the back seat. Nnamdi was sitting between them. His head was turned toward her in the mirror. His eyes, those two wide, two still eyes, were fixed on her face. The children were looking at their tablets, unbothered, completely unaware of the thing sitting between them. And the car swerved violently as Tessy screamed and grabbed the wheel, and the driver in the next lane leaned on his horn, and the children looked up, startled, saying, "Mummy, Mummy, what happened?" She pulled over. She sat on the side of the expressway, with her hazard lights blinking and her hands shaking on the wheel, and she looked in the rearview mirror, and the back seat held only her children. "Mummy, are you okay?" her daughter asked. "Yes," Tessy said. "Yes, baby. Mommy is fine." But her voice was not fine. Her voice was the voice of a woman who was beginning to understand that some things could not be driven away from. October came. He was in the bathroom mirror while she brushed her teeth, standing just behind her reflection, present only in the glass, gone when she spun around. He was at the dining table when she served the children dinner, seated in his old chair at the head of the table, not eating, not moving, just watching her with that expression. That was not quite accusation and not quite sorrow, but something that lived in the terrible space between the two. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping. She lost weight that she could not afford to lose, and the hollows under her eyes deepened, and her mother asked her 3 times what was wrong, and each time Tessy said nothing. "I'm fine. I'm just tired." The worst was when it happened in company. She was at her colleague Ngozi's birthday gathering a small thing, drinks and small chops in someone's living room in Wuse 2, and she was mid-conversation with a woman she barely knew, nodding along to something about school fees. And then the woman's face simply changed. Between one blink and the next, it was Nnamdi's face on the woman's body, staring at her from across a plate of puff-puff. And Tessy knocked her drink off the table and stumbled backward into someone and had to be helped to a chair. And people were asking, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Do you need water?" And she was saying, "Yes, yes. I'm fine." I just felt dizzy, but she was not fine. She had not been fine since March. She called Chukwudi one night in November, sitting in her car in the compound, because she could no longer trust the inside of the house. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "Tessy, lower your voice. There is no one here, Chukwudi. The children are asleep." She laughed a terrible, fractured sound. "Unless you count him. He's always here. He's always everywhere I go. I see him in mirrors. I see him in the car. I see him in people's faces. Stop it. I see him in the garden, Chukwudi. I look at that tree, and I... Stop talking like this. You're going to get us both locked up. Locked up. As if prison were the thing she was afraid of now. As if 4 walls and a sentence were the nightmare she lay awake dreading. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. "He wants me to confess," she whispered. "Tessy, that's what he wants. I can feel it. That's why he won't leave. He wants everyone to know what I did to him." The silence on the line was long enough that she checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. "If you confess," Chukwudi finally said, "we both go to prison. You understand that? Both of us. Your children will grow up without a mother and without a father. Is that what you want? She closed her eyes. The frangipani tree was visible through the windshield. In the yellow glow of the compound light, it looked almost beautiful. She told herself she could hold on. She told herself the mind would adjust. She told herself that guilt was survivable, that people carried worse and continued living. She went back inside. Nnamdi was sitting on the edge of their bed. December arrived like a reckoning. She had not slept a full night in 2 months. She was taking pills that no longer worked. She had started flinching at her own shadow, checking reflections before she looked into them, keeping the lights on in every room of the house until the electricity bill made Chukwudi ask uncomfortable questions. The children had started to notice. Her daughter, 5 years old, Chukwudi's eyes in a cherub's face, had climbed into her lap one evening and pressed a small hand to her cheek and said, "Mummy, why are you always scared?" Tessy had held the child and cried in a way she had not cried since this all began. Not the managed, performative crying she had used for the police and Nnamdi's family. Real crying, the ugly, airless kind that comes from somewhere below the chest, from the part of a person where the truth lives, when it has nowhere else to go. Why are you always scared? Because he is here, baby. Because he will not leave. Because I put him in the ground, and the ground gave him back to me in pieces, in mirrors, and windows, and strangers' faces, and I don't think he is going to stop. I don't think the dead stop until they get what they want, and what he wants is the one thing I am most afraid to give. The truth. It happened on a Saturday morning, the 2nd week of December. She was in the garden. She had come out to call the children in for breakfast, and they were playing near the back fence, and she walked across the grass and stopped. She was standing directly over the frangipani tree. The soil beneath it was slightly uneven in a way that suddenly, horribly, resolved itself into meaning. She had looked at this ground 100 times in the past 9 months. She had hung laundry nearby, chased the children away from it, watched the tree flower and drop its blooms across the disturbed earth. She had looked at it and looked away, the way you look away from something your eyes are delivering to a mind that refuses to receive it. She stood over it now, and she could not look away. And then she looked up. Nnamdi was standing on the other side of the tree, in daylight. In the clear, hard light of a December morning, with the children laughing 30 feet away, and the sound of a neighbor's generator humming over the fence, he was standing there, and he was looking at her. And for the first time since this began, his expression was not horror, and it was not accusation. It was exhaustion. He looked the way she felt. He looked like a man who was tired. He looked like a man who had been waiting a very long time for something that should have been simple, something that should not have required all of this. And he was looking at her with those 2 wide eyes, and she understood, with a completeness that hit her like cold water, that she was looking at a man who simply wanted to go home. "Let me go home, Tessy." She did not hear it, but she heard it. She stood in her garden in the December morning light, and she made a sound that was not quite a word, and her knees hit the grass, and she pressed both hands over her mouth, and she wept. She drove to Nnamdi's family house in Lugbe that afternoon. His mother opened the door. Mama Nnamdi, a small dry woman in her 70s, who had aged 15 years since March, whose grief had settled into her face as something permanent. She looked at Tessy on her doorstep, and her expression did not change. "Tessy." "Mama." Her voice was barely there. "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you something about Nnamdi." Mama Nnamdi looked at her for a long time. Then she stepped back from the door. Tessy walked inside. She sat on the edge of a plastic chair in that familiar living room. She had sat in this room 100 times for Christmas and Easter and family meetings. And she folded her hands in her lap, and she told Nnamdi's mother everything. Not some of it. Not the managed, selective version she had been constructing in her head for months, the version with softened edges and redistributed blame. Everything. From the first call to Chukwudi, 6 months into the marriage, to the children who were not Nnamdi's, to the Friday evening in March, to the garden, to 9 months of carrying what she had done, pressed against the inside of her chest like a stone. Mama Nnamdi did not cry. She sat across from Tessy and listened with the stillness of a woman who had already, somewhere deep inside herself, known the shape of the truth before she heard it. When Tessy finished, the room was very quiet. "My son," the old woman said. Just that. Just my son, in a voice so completely emptied of everything that it was worse than screaming. Tessy went to the police station 2 hours later. They came to the house on a Tuesday. Tessy stood at the back door and watched them dig up the frangipani tree, and she thought about the fact that it was a Tuesday, Chukwudi's day. She thought that was either the most meaningless coincidence imaginable or the most precise possible punctuation on 4 years of Tuesdays. Chukwudi was picked up at his workshop in Lugbe at the same hour. Nnamdi was exhumed from his own garden 9 months after he had been placed there by the woman he had called Nem and the man she had loved instead of him. He was taken to the mortuary, and 2 weeks later, after the examinations were complete, his family buried him properly in the red earth of his hometown in Anambra, with a white casket and church songs, and his mother's hand pressed flat against the wood as they lowered him down. Tessy was not there. She was in a holding cell in Abuja. But she was told, later, that it was a clear day, no clouds. The kind of day, they said, that felt like something had been released. The trial lasted 4 months. The prosecution was thorough. The forensic evidence was thorough. Chukwudi's phone records were thorough. The children's DNA was thorough. Everything that Tessy had built her life on, the careful separations, the managed distances, the architecture of a double life, turned out, in a courtroom, to amount to nothing more than a clear and documented record of what she had done and why. She did not fight it. She had lost the will to fight it, somewhere in that garden on a December morning looking at a tired ghost. Her lawyer argued mitigating circumstances. The prosecution argued premeditation. The judge, a severe woman in her 60s, who looked at Tessy for a long time before she spoke, argued nothing. She simply read the sentence in a voice as flat and final as a door closing. Life imprisonment. Chukwudi received the same. Her children went to Nnamdi's sister. A good woman, a patient woman, who had moved in for 2 weeks after the disappearance to help with laundry and cooking, and who had, in some part of herself, she may not have fully understood, already begun to love them. Tessy was allowed a supervised visit before she was transferred to the Women's Correctional Facility in Suleja. Her daughter climbed into her lap one last time and pressed a small hand to her cheek. "Mommy," she said, "when are you coming home?" Tessy held her daughter's face the way Chukwudi had once held hers, the way you hold something you are trying to memorize, something you know you are about to lose the right to, and she said nothing. There was nothing she could say that would be kind enough, or honest enough, or sufficient to the size of what she had taken from this child by taking it from her father. She held her. The guard said it was time. She let go. They say that in the women's wing of Suleja, there is a woman who does not sleep well, who asks, in the small hours of the night, for the lights to be left on, who sometimes wakes the whole corridor with a sound that is not quite a scream, something more tired than a scream, something that has been worn down by repetition into a low, helpless moan. They say she still sees him sometimes. Not in mirrors now. There are no private mirrors where she is. Not in strangers' faces. But sometimes in the dark behind her closed eyelids, a man in a blue and white agbada, standing very still, looking at her with eyes that have stopped being angry and are only endlessly sad. She deserves it. She knows she deserves it. But she thinks, sometimes lying on her narrow prison bunk in the 3 a.m. silence, about a garden in Gwarimpa, about a tree that smelled sweet, even in December, about a man who wept when his children were born, who planted that tree himself, who called her name and meant it. She thinks about the fact that there are 2 kinds of haunting. There is the kind that comes from the outside, the ghost in the mirror, the face in the rearview glass, the cold that follows you from room to room until you confess. And there is the kind that lives inside you, the kind that does not need a ghost, the kind that will be there in the dark long after the ghost has finally, mercifully, gone home. That kind, she understands now, does not end. That kind is the sentence within the sentence. That kind is forever. The frangipani tree was removed. The house was sold. Nnamdi's family did not want it. The new owners planted a different garden entirely. But on some mornings in December, when the light falls at a certain angle across the backyard, the woman next door says she sometimes catches the faint, sweet smell of frangipani on the air. She has never been able to explain it. She has stopped trying.